The dawn sun, as usual, was pouring down on my Manhattan penthouse, but this morning its golden rays felt cold to me, like the glint of an ice blade held to my throat. I stood face to face with my own reflection in the panoramic window, and saw not the successful, 45-year-old billionaire Noah Harding, architect of the global technological empire AetherCorp, but an emaciated, almost empty shell, who had just been told the worst by a medical concierge. Not cancer, not bankruptcy, but a complete, irreversible lack of empathy, officially confirmed by a rare neurological condition that had eaten away at my ability to feel and sympathize. My world, built on iron logic, endless deals, and an impeccable reputation, suddenly became a house of cards, bursting at the seams by a single, murderous word: sociopath. I had always prided myself on my rationality, on my ability to dismiss emotions as noise, as unnecessary ballast on the path to absolute efficiency, considering it the quintessence of the American dream, a tough game where the strongest, coldest mind wins. And now, when the doctor, the same one who had maintained my perfect health for years, whispered about a disorder in the prefrontal cortex, I felt only a strange, almost scientific curiosity. Here it was, an architectural mistake that had made me not just successful, but a monster devoid of a moral compass, functioning only thanks to a well-practiced imitation of human behavior. The real blow, however, came not from the medical diagnosis but later, during a board meeting, where I was distracted by thoughts of my neurochemical emptiness and listening intently to my longtime partner, Marcus, summarizing the quarterly reports with cold, almost hateful precision, when suddenly my phone lit up, showing a single, black message from my daughter, Emily. "I know about the foundation. You should be ashamed of yourself. I'm leaving." Those 3 words, "I know about the foundation," rang louder than any explosion, because the foundation I had secretly funded was a front, an elaborate scheme to launder billions through offshore accounts that I believed absolutely no one but my lawyer and myself knew existed. It was obvious that my own daughter, the only person I had ever tried to love, had discovered my darkest secret, and now, realizing that she had abandoned me not because of my busyness or coldness, but because of the criminal nature of my American success, I felt not pain, not despair, but only a sudden, unbearable anger, born of the fact that my perfectly controlled world, my flawless game, was crumbling. I looked at Marcus, who suddenly seemed too calm, too confident, and realized the diagnosis and betrayal of my daughter were only the first bell, and the real horror was hidden in the eyes of a man who knew how to destroy me and, perhaps, had already begun to do so. My first instinct, dictated by decades of ruthless corporate dominance, was not desperation but a cold, surgical need for control. I instantly ordered Emily's accounts frozen, initiated an internal investigation within AetherCorp into the foundation leak, and hired a private investigator to find my daughter, acting with the same impeccable efficiency with which I would eliminate a competitor in the marketplace. But this familiar mask of all-powerful leader began to crack when I encountered unexpected resistance. Marcus, my old comrade in arms, the one I considered my second-in-command in the company, refused to sign off on the new anti-crisis package without a shadow of a doubt, citing the opacity of my personal financial transactions, which was the moment I realized that the game had moved to another plane, where instead of money and technology, trust and reputation were at stake, of which, as it turned out, I had much less than I thought. I summoned Marcus to my office, and the pressure in the room was so thick that you could cut it with a knife. I looked at his perfectly tied tie, at his impassive face, and realized that in front of me was not a partner, but an enemy who was methodically collecting evidence of my demise. "Do you really think, Marcus, that you can bypass me? I built this empire brick by brick while you were busy with fiscal reports." "You don't know who you contacted," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, just the steely, dangerous tone of an owner defending his territory. Marcus just smiled calmly, leaning back in his chair. I know Noah, with an empty shell that believes that American success is measured only by zeros on a bank account, ignoring that behind every zero there is a human life. Do you think the foundation is your biggest problem? No, Noah. The biggest problem is that you made people believe that you felt, and now they're learning the truth. His words, a direct allusion to my medical diagnosis, which I had only told my lawyer, were shocking confirmation. Marcus was not just a disgruntled partner, but a mastermind, and it was he who had probably framed me in front of Emily, using her emotions as a weapon. The thought brought not rage but a strange, bitter admiration for his strategy, and then I saw the news of the internal scandal at AetherCorp begin to explode in the media. Noah Harding, billionaire sociopath? The Hope Fund, a pyramid scheme, victims demand justice. By the end of the week, the company's stock had fallen 60%, and federal agents were already knocking on my office door demanding financial records. I stood atop the ruins of my world, looking down at the empty space where my reputation had once been, and for the first time in my life I felt not fear but an emptiness that resonated with my diagnosis. Total loss, but without the emotional pain. Just a perfectly orchestrated, flawless failure. I sat alone in my underground bunker, equipped as a high-tech command center, which now resembled more of a gloomy prison, and my only company was the glare of screens broadcasting an endless stream of negative news and warrants for the seizure of my property. All my American success, consecrated by decades of work and ingenuity, was now reduced to a series of criminal articles. And I understood that Marcus did not just want to eliminate me, he sought complete, public destruction, wanting to prove to the world that a cold mind without a heart does not deserve success. When all my contacts, lobbyists, and lawyers had turned their backs on me, fearing a fall, I suddenly received an encrypted email on the secure server I had set up early in my career, and its single line, "Your wife knew, Noah. Look under the Seychelles tree," caught my attention instantly, for it was the code key my wife, Sarah, and I had used since she died 5 years ago, long before I had become this flawless money-making machine. I left the bunker and went for the first time in weeks to our old estate in the Hamptons, the one I had almost sold for the sterile glitz of Manhattan. The garden was neglected, but the Seychelles tree, an exotic species Sarah adored for its hypertrophied seeds, stood untouched, a monument to a time when I might still have been human. Under the tree, in a place I would never have found without a key, lay an old metal box, filled not with money or jewelry but with one of Sarah's thick, yellow journals. I opened it, feeling a strange, almost unpleasant pressure in my chest, and began to read. Sarah had not just been keeping a journal of our lives, she had been systematically documenting not only my growing emotional detachment, but also the shady dealings Marcus had been conducting behind my back, using the foundation as a cover for much larger, international schemes that had nothing to do with my own machinations. The notes detailed how Marcus, by abusing my trust and documenting my financial crimes, was actually playing a double game. He was using my diagnosis as a sociopath as the perfect cover to hide his own, much larger conspiracy with a foreign government, not just to take over AetherCorp, but to use its technology to manipulate the world's financial markets. The biggest revelation came on the last page. Sarah suspected that Marcus, not natural causes, was behind her untimely death because she had come to know too much, and she had left the only solid evidence of his guilt hidden in the only unopened box in my bank safe. At that moment, I realized I was not just a victim, I was a pawn in his game, and my own immorality served as the perfect cover for him. Now that I had access to my wife's forbidden knowledge, for the first time in a long time, my empty world had not just a plan but a real, cold purpose, not to vindicate myself, but to restore justice for Sarah and Emily by proving that Marcus was the true predator. With the new knowledge that Sarah had left in her diary, my actions took on a clarity that had stripped away the selfish motivations of my past, transforming from a desire for self-preservation to a desire to expose the betrayal that had cost my wife her life and destroyed my bond with my daughter. For the first time, I felt something that could be called a moral obligation, although my brain refused to register it as an emotion, but rather as the ultimate, most complex logical task I had to solve. I made my way to the bank vault, where I did indeed find a small USB drive, encrypted in Sarah's handwriting, containing an audio recording of a conversation between Marcus and the powerful foreign minister that directly confirmed not only the financial fraud, but also his involvement in Sarah's death, as well as his intention to shift all blame for the scheme onto me, using my official diagnosis of sociopathy as evidence. I knew this was my only shot, and it had to be perfect. I knew that Marcus, convinced of my isolation and failure, had called an emergency press conference to publicly announce my resignation and a rescue restructuring of AetherCorp, and this was the perfect moment for my strike. I didn't go to the police or the FBI, because I knew his connections in Washington were too deep. Instead, I called Emily, for the first time in a month, and her voice was as cold as ice. "I don't want to listen to you, Dad. Your manipulation is over," she said. I didn't try to make excuses. I didn't apologize, because I knew my words meant nothing to her. "Emily, Marcus killed your mother. He used my crimes to cover up his own. I know you don't trust me, but I can give you proof. I need your access to the company's old security network. This isn't about my money. This is about her truth. You decide." The tense silence lasted what seemed like an eternity, and I imagined her weighing her hatred for me against her love for her mother, and finally she said just one word: "Where?" I sent her the coordinates and clear instructions on how to use her old administrative access. The next day, I showed up at Marcus's press conference, which caused a real shock among the journalists and shareholders. Marcus tried to stop me, but I grabbed the microphone, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Marcus, you're right. I was empty. I did terrible things. But you did worse. You chose the path not just of success, but of destruction. And now it's time to prove that I was just your front for you." At that moment, thanks to Emily's actions, the audio recording Sarah had recorded began to play on the main screen behind Marcus, and a graphic visualization of his offshore accounts appeared below, directly indicating his betrayal. It was the moment I put everything on the line: my freedom, the remnants of my fortune, and the only chance at a spark of humanity that was burning inside me. Marcus's revelation was absolute and devastating. His face, hitherto impassive, paled as he heard his own voice negotiating the details of Sarah's elimination, and his escape attempt was quickly cut short by the FBI agents already in the room, as I made sure to anonymously send a copy of the recording to the authorities as my final, coldly calculated act of cleansing, which had nothing to do with atonement, but more with the need to settle scores. My role in the scandal, though shifted from chief predator to co-organizer, had not disappeared. The consequences of my own financial misdeeds were all too obvious, and I knew that there was no escaping responsibility for my sins of American success. I stood on stage, surrounded by camera flashes, and the only thing I felt was a strange, pure peace. The game was over, and though I had lost my wealth and my freedom, I had won the truth for Emily, and that was all that mattered. The trial lasted for almost a year, becoming the main topic of the world's media, where my story was told as a parable of the fall of the billionaire sociopath, the perfect creation of a hardline, ruthless capitalist system that rewarded emptiness. I pleaded guilty to financial crimes, but my testimony, supported by Sarah's evidence, helped to finally convict Marcus of much more serious crimes, including conspiracy and murder. I was sentenced to a long term in a minimum security federal prison. On the last day before I went to prison, Emily came to see me in my defense attorney's office. She looked tired, but there was no hatred in her eyes, only a cold, cautious assessment. "You didn't do it for yourself, Dad. You did it for Mom," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But that doesn't change what you did to me and everyone else. This is no atonement." I looked at her, and despite my diagnosed lack of empathy, something like a realization dawned on me. Maybe atonement wasn't a feeling, it was an action. "You're right, Emily," I said. "It's not atonement. I didn't apologize because I don't know how. I did it because maybe even an empty car has an instinct to protect what it once held dear. The foundation will be restructured. All the money will go to real relief." I signed all the papers. "This is your company now, Emily. Make it better than I could." She silently picked up the folder of documents, her gaze fixed on the void, and before she left, she looked around. "Can you be rich and honest, Noah?" I replied, looking out the window at the empty streets. "I don't know. But now you have a chance to find out. Maybe truth is more important than success." I was left alone, walking to my punishment, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel defeated, but rather a blank slate, where perhaps the true story of success was just beginning, where the zeros on the score had no meaning.